So I'm sure all of you are very excited to learn more about the topic tonight on thesis writing. Okay, so just before that, I promise that I won't take much of your time. Okay, so I won't take more than 10 minutes of your time. So my team from CDTL, okay, would like to share with you the first e-module on presentation skills that we have developed. Okay, so this module would actually help you improve your presentation skills. Okay. So this project is concentrating on preparing a successful presentation, and the first module would actually cover effective techniques and strategies that can be used when preparing a presentation. So some of the highlights of this project would have videos. So videos that would actually discuss to you the four processes in terms of preparing your presentation. You will also have self-test to practice your learning. And lastly, you would have a way here to ask questions or clarify some questions to the lecturer. So this is how the form would look like. So in case you have any questions regarding the topic, so you can get in touch with the presenter. All right? So if you would like to learn more about this e-module, so you can visit this website. So this is emodule.nus.edu.sg/presentation skills. So let me just show you the website. Yeah. So you can also browse this e-module through the CDTL site. So this is it's not actually showing the URL on your screen, but if you while we are actually experiencing some technical problems, so again, we would like to let you know the URL of our e-module. So it's emodule.nus.edu.sg/presentation skills. So this is the URL, and were you able to jot down the URL? Yeah? Alright. And from here, we would like to thank our module speaker, Mr. Patrick Gallo. Okay. And thank you. And now I would give the floor to Dr. Chitra. Thank you, Dr. Chitra.
Thank you very much. I'm Chitra, Dr. Chitra from the Center for English Language Communication. I teach a thesis writing module, and I'm very happy to be here today to share whatever I know about thesis writing, in particular, an analytical approach. Thank you for being here this evening. It's good to see so many of you here. And I readily volunteered to do this workshop. That's because, like you, some years ago, I was a PhD student, but there were no such workshops to guide me. And looking back, I think I would have benefited greatly from workshops of this kind. So thanks to CDTL, we are all here together to learn and to share. Now, I'm using the word share because I'm going to be sharing some information with you, but then I know you come from a variety of disciplines. I understand there are many of you from engineering, many from science, from medicine, etc. And you do bring some background knowledge with you. So let's make this session interactive, okay? So the sharing is going to be both ways. Feel free to give me your input, to ask questions, etc. as we go along, okay? Now, why is thesis writing a challenge? All of you are here because it's a challenge, right? Why do you think it's a challenge? Before I tell you why it was a challenge for me as a few years ago, I'd like to know what you have to say. Anybody? Why is it a challenge? Remember I said it's going to be interactive, a sharing session. What is the biggest challenge you face? Sorry? It's long. Very good. Yes, it's long.
I don't know what the other people don't know about what I want to write.
Oh, you don't know what other people know about what you want to write. That's a bit difficult for me too. Yes. Yes. I can identify with that. Anything else? Difficult to arrange the logical flow of information. Yes. Anything else? Getting down the first paper. The page, yes. You're talking about the introduction. Yes? Okay. Some years ago, I too was a PhD student. Okay? Thesis writing was a challenge to me, and I was a teacher, a lecturer, teaching writing to undergraduate students. I thought, thesis writing should be a breeze. I know how to write. And I said, let me focus on data collection because that's the most important part. So I worked on the data collection methods. I identified my research objectives first and started to work on data collection, did my pilot study, analyzed the results, did my final study, analyzed the results, and I said 3 months should be enough for me to sit and write. Okay? But then at the writing stage, I was overwhelmed. You know why? I had all these computer output, regarding my results. All the data was there. It was all analyzed. I had stacks of photocopied journal articles for my literature review, highlighted in pink and yellow and green. And I had a whole lot of other articles as well. I had all this information in front of me, all the content information in front of me. But I felt overwhelmed. I felt intimidated. And like someone said, I had starting problems. I didn't know where to begin. I didn't know what to begin with. So it is very, very natural that any form of academic writing, whether it is thesis writing, whether it is a journal paper, whether it's a term paper, or even an academic essay, can be quite challenging. Because academic writing, all these different text types that we call them, have a genre of their own. In other words, they have certain conventions that students need to follow. And if students are not aware of these conventions, they have problems with writing. So my objective today is to basically raise your awareness about these different conventions. Why an analytical approach? If you looked at the title, it said, An Analytical Approach to Thesis Writing. Why did I choose the word analytical? Let me share my student experience again. I had identified my research questions. I started reading up. I planned my pilot study. Then one afternoon, I said, let me go to the Central Library and look at the thesis there. I went to the library, and this is what I found. I found these massive documents all stacked, and when I looked at them again, I was terrified. I said, how am I going to produce this massive document? Okay, where do I get, at that stage, I didn't have enough information either. I said, where am I going to get information for this massive document? And they were so impressive, nice navy blue, and the names and the titles etched in gold, and that didn't help, It was pretty, but it didn't help me. So then I opened the thesis, and I looked at the table of contents, and then I saw the several chapters. Then I told myself, maybe I shouldn't look at this massive whole. I should look at the parts. Okay? And then I realized, as I looked at the introduction chapter, the literature review, the methods, the results, etc., I found if I focused on these parts, things may be easier. Then writing became that much more manageable because I was able to visualize this big whole into several parts. And I told myself, focus on the parts to begin with, then the whole will take care of itself. So this is why I've used the word an analytical approach in my title. Now, there are three aspects to thesis writing. All of you know that. You're all, I'm sure, research students, masters, PhD students. We have content, we have organization, and we have language. Content is not my forte today because you're all from different disciplines. You are the specialists in your field. I'm not qualified to comment on content at all. Talking about language, again, language is very individual. The problems, because I teach a thesis writing module, I know the students have different problems. Each student has different problems with language. Some students have problems with clarity in writing. Some students have problems with grammatical elements, prepositions, articles are a big problem. Even parallel structures are a big problem. So today I'm not going to be dealing with language either, so that leaves us with organization. We will mainly be looking at organization. How do you organize your thesis? Okay? So what will this session focus on? The first question we will be addressing is, I'm saying we, you notice that? Because you're going to chip in as well. What is the overall macro organization of a thesis? What are the different chapters of a thesis? Question one. What purposes do these chapters serve? Now, this is something students always forget. Each chapter has a purpose. And it's good to have this purpose in mind when you write your different chapters. How are these chapters organized? We'll specially focus on the introduction and conclusion chapters. And then, how can I establish connections between these chapters and within each chapter? Somebody mentioned flow earlier. We will be looking very briefly at how you can establish this flow. Now, let's move on to thesis organization. Overall, the macro thesis organization, there are three patterns of organization. Some of you could be familiar with this already. There is the traditional pattern of organization, there is topic-based, and there's paper-based organization. Now, what do we mean by traditional pattern of organization? This pattern of organization is what is known as IMRDC. The I in the acronym stands for introduction, the M stands for methodology, the R stands for results, D for discussion, and C for conclusion. Sometimes acronyms can be very useful when you want to remember things, okay? Now, looking at the introduction chapter, you can have a 2-chapter introduction or a 1-chapter introduction. Now, what do I mean by that? 1-chapter introduction will include the literature review, okay? But in some disciplines, the literature review is a chapter on its own. For example, I come from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Literature review is very, very important for us because it is in this chapter that you show evidence of your in-depth knowledge, your scholarship, your learning. So the literature review is a very important chapter for us, so it is a separate chapter. But some of my students tell me that the review forms a part of the introduction chapter in some disciplines. So the learning point here is you need to know how your thesis is organized in your discipline. Ask your supervisor, go and take a look at the other thesis, the related thesis, in your area, in your topic, and see how it is organized, okay? Methodology, of course, we'll talk about the materials, the procedures, the experiments, how you conducted your experiments in the lab. In the case of arts students, FASS students, we talk about data collection methods, the surveys, the questionnaires, etc. that we do, okay? The results chapter, all of you are familiar. I find my students that I teach are very comfortable with writing the results section. Then there is the discussion and conclusion, which includes implications and recommendations. I will talk about each of these as I go along, okay? Article compilation. Now, my students tell me that some of them are expected to publish in prominent journals. They publish about 3 to 4 articles, okay, during the course of their PhD work, and each of those articles forms a chapter in the thesis. So you can see the format, the organization will change slightly. So each chapter will consist of an introduction, the aims of the study, the definitions, if there's terminology to be defined, and justifications for the study. And then there's literature review again, very briefly mentioned, and then the method, results, and discussion would be combined into one, and they will have a brief conclusion for each of those chapters. There are some students who tell me that the conclusion forms a separate chapter. In other words, each journal paper is a chapter, and they have a general conclusion chapter. So again, if your thesis is consists of article compilation, please go and check how it is organized in your discipline. Topic-based. Topic-based now, what my students tell me is that the thesis title is divided into several subtopics, and each chapter deals with one of these topics, okay? So each chapter, again, consists of all these sections. Like the results and discussion would be combined. There would be brief literature review, there would be brief theoretical framework, but these are optional, okay? Unless your study demands it, you will not include this. And then conclusions, again, forms a part of the subtopic. So you can see the way your thesis is going to be organized will depend a lot on what the focus of your study is, okay? Whether it is article compilation or whether it is topic-based, or it could follow the general traditional pattern of organization. Next, remember the IMRD framework. We move on to the introduction now. Now, what is the purpose of the introduction section? Somebody said you have starting problems, and research has shown that students have problems writing the introductory section. They do not know where to begin. Now, identify the purpose of your introduction. What is the purpose? It is to provide a context for your research. if you all recall, if you think about your thesis, we are all looking at a very narrow area in this very, very broad area, right? If you think about it, we are very specialized, we learn a lot, we explore one small area in detail. So we have this broad area, and our research is located in that broad area, okay? So it's very important to contextualize our research, and this is what we do in the introduction section. How do you contextualize your research? I will talk about it later. In addition to contextualizing your research, you review the work done in your area. This is where your literature review comes in. And this is where you tell your examiner, you tell your readers how well you have understood your field. So reviewing previous research is very, very important. And as you review your previous research, you also identify aspects of research that have not been covered by other researchers. And then you introduce your research in this context, telling your reader, this is what has not been looked at, and this is what my research is doing. Okay? So this, in short, is the purpose of your introduction. Introduction organization. How is the introduction organized? Again, another acronym. In Singapore, we have acronyms for everything. So this is another acronym here in the academic context. So organization of introduction, CRGP. Context, review, gap, and purpose. So we will look at each of these components. Now, can you take a look at the handouts that all of you should have with you? Look at sample 1, please. If you take a look at sample 1, I have to admit this extract is not from a thesis, it's from a journal paper, because thesis extracts can be very, very long. But this is this article here lends itself to teaching the 4 categories that I'm talking about. Okay, so if you look at this journal paper here, you can see it is very neatly organized into the 4 components that I just mentioned. Page 2, you have the context, followed by the review. Okay, move on to page 3, please. You have the gap, followed by the purpose. Okay, so those of you who still have not started writing your introduction, remember these 4 components that constitute the introductory chapter. But remember, this is a journal paper. Your thesis chapter could be 10 times the length of this. Okay, so you will be elaborating on each of these when you write your introduction. Okay, context. How do you organize your context? CRGP, remember, we are focusing on context. Context, remember I said earlier, our research is located in this broad area. So when you write your context, you begin with this general area, and which includes ideas broadly related to the research of the thesis. One of my students asked me, how do I identify what the general area is? Look at the title of your thesis. That will tell you what the general area is. Okay? Then, having written about the general area, you move into the sub-area, which deals with ideas more closely related to your research. Remember, the general area is broadly related. Then you gradually move into the sub-area, and you talk about ideas closely related to the research. And then you zoom into your key topic, that is, ideas very closely related to the topic of your thesis. Okay? So this is how you organize your context section. Again, can I refer you to page 2 in your handout? Look at the context section. The general area, looking at the title, those of you who have some background knowledge maybe will be able to explain this better, okay? I'm going just by the general terminology here. You can see fabrication of microstructures is the broad area here. The first sentence tells you what the general area is, and then when you go down to sentence 2, of interest to this work are three-dimensional, 3D, high aspect ratio objects. Moving on to the sub-area, and then as you come down towards the end, the key topic is introduced. Since you are content specialists, you should be able to identify the general, the sub-area, and the key topic even better than me, because I don't know your discipline, okay? This basically deals with the organization of the context section of the introduction. Review, the literature review. What is the purpose? The literature review, in the literature review, I've listed out all these things here, but it depends on your thesis, on your topic, so you may focus on just a few of these issues, okay? For example, key issues which underline the research. Pertaining to theory in particular, what are some of the key issues that are very, very pertinent to your area of study? Major findings on the research topic. What have other people discovered in your area? Number 3, points of view and controversies, perspectives of other researchers on the topic or related topic. Critical evaluation of these views. In fact, I was talking to someone here, and he tells me, students, when it comes to literature review, just list the studies that have been done. Remember, critical evaluation is very, very important. I will talk about it later. General conclusions about the state of the art. Remember, your references have to be very up to date. So, say if we start our PhD, say 4 years ago, and then we start writing only when we are in our 3rd year, please keep in touch with the latest developments that are happening, and remember to update your literature review chapter as you go along. With computers now, it's so easy to keep adding on new information that we read about, okay? Review of literature. How do you organize your literature review? You organize your literature review by talking about previous research. You report on previous research, that is, what have they done? What have they achieved in their studies? And thirdly, you comment on previous research. Can we take a look at page 2 again, the review section, just to highlight some of these points, okay? You can see this literature review, of course, is very, very brief, but like I said, your chapter will be much longer, maybe 10 times longer than this, but it is very neatly organized, okay? What is the writer doing here? If you look at the left-hand margin, the second column, review of current fabrication techniques, okay? He's organized the previous research in terms of the 2 techniques that he's going to review. Studies pertaining to the 2 techniques that he's going to review. Group 1, he has batch patterning techniques. Group 2, he has probe-directed techniques, and he's reviewing studies pertaining to these 2 techniques. So he begins by identifying 2 groups of studies that he wants to review. That's one way of organizing. I am sure you will be able to organize it in other ways as well, in terms of maybe the methods they use, in terms of the materials that other researchers used. You know, once you have the information, you can ask yourself, how can I organize all these studies that I need to review? There's bound to be a pattern that you can identify. And this person does it in 2 groups of patterning techniques. And then he reports on the review. What have they achieved in the review? What have they done in their studies? And then he also comments on the review. If you look at the underline sentence 6, page 2, probe-directed techniques, many of which are still under development, overcome some of the above limitations. That means in the earlier batch, he's identified some limitations, and he's commenting on those limitations, and he moves on to explain. This is commenting on previous research. If you turn to page 3, again, I've underlined another limitation there. Don't worry about the content bit, okay? We are only dealing with concepts here, okay? The resolution achieved by LACVD is limited by the diffraction. He's talking about the limitation again. So you can see your literature review chapter needs to be organized by previous research. You report on the work done by these researchers, and then you also comment on the research. It could be positive comments, it could be negative comments. Commenting on previous research, I just mentioned positive evaluation, for example, achievements of particular studies, negative evaluations, limitations in the literature or weaknesses of particular study. This I mention again, avoid just listing the work done. Another point to remember is, wherever possible, whatever studies you're reviewing related to your work, talk about the relevance to your work. Otherwise, there is no point in listing all those studies there. They must be pertinent to what you're doing in some way. So, relate your studies to your research. That is very important. Sample 1, look at the underlined sections. These are the comments. I've already drawn your attention to it. Let me give you some examples here. Lim and Murthy's distribution idea is innovative. Innovative, very positive. However, immediately you know there is a however, there is something negative coming, right? The estimation error accumulated during the iterative steps can be quite significant. Negative point coming. Based on the above discussion, this is a very good summary statement for literature review, where you review a group of studies and then you summarize and bring in your critical evaluation. Based on the above discussion, it can be seen the causes and potential benefits of have been emphasized. But little effort has been made to reveal the main driving forces of building adaptation using empirical evidence. Can you see the positive and the negative evaluation coming in literature review? Very, very important. Next, we move on to, remember our CRGP, we move on to gap and purpose. And what is the purpose of this section in the introduction? To identify the gap and state the research purpose. Can we go back and look at our first sample, please? Page 3. Can we look at page 3? Look at the gap column there. Studies on these effects have been mainly experimental in nature, but without quantitative modeling. You are already establishing a gap for your study by saying that you could be looking at quantitative modeling. So look at the next sentence. A quantitative evaluation of the progressive formation of the localized deposit is necessary. This is how you establish your gap. You contextualize your study, you review your studies, then you identify the gap, and after that you state the purpose of your study. The last column, this work presents both experimental investigation and theoretical modeling. The focus of the study is presented. Okay? So you can see for yourself how you can organize the introduction, your introductory chapter. Context, review, gap, and purpose. You can use this sample, but it's not a model, okay? It's not a perfect model. Actually, the samples are all written by students, okay? So there could be some language problems even. It's quite possible, okay? But you can use it as a sample to guide you in your writing. Okay, gap and purpose, organization. I told you this is a journal paper. Now we are looking at the organization of gap and purpose in a thesis. What should you include? What are the different elements? Number 1, you summarize identified research gaps. Gap will always follow your review. Okay? So you summarize the gaps for your reader, and following the gaps, of course, will be the purpose of your study, because you've identified these gaps, areas or issues that others have not addressed and that you hope to address in your research. So you state your purpose, your aims, your research questions, your hypotheses, whatever it may be. In your gap and purpose, you also state the value or the significance of your study. Since it's the introductory chapter, your significance will be only predictions. These are hopes you have for your research. So you talk about it in tentative terms. You say, this research may contribute to this area of da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay? Significance. You also state the scope of your study. Remember, I mentioned earlier, we are looking at a very small, narrow area. There are so many other aspects that we could have looked at. Your examiner can ask you, why didn't you look at this? Why didn't you look at that? Why did you look at only this part? Before you can tell your examiner orally, I think you should put it down in writing. Tell your reader, these are my boundaries. I only looked at these aspects because you explain. I did not look at these other aspects, and then you explain. Okay? So the scope, again, is very important in your introductory chapter. Outline your theoretical position. If you have any theoretical stand or stance that you're taking, any theory that your study is based on, you can mention it in a few lines here. Similarly, methods. Aims and methods sometimes can be mentioned together if you've used particular methods to achieve your objectives. Okay? And then you also indicate your thesis structure. What is the organization of your thesis? Now, I think I've spoken enough. I would like you to turn to page 4. There's a sample 2 there. This is a gap and purpose section of a thesis that one of my students wrote. Okay? Now, what I would like you to do is given in the handout already. Okay? Analyze the text below for its following organizational elements. I've given you a list of the different organizational elements. I've identified the gaps under the information organization. What I would like you to do is individually identify the other elements in the text, okay? And then you can quickly discuss with your neighbors the answers to your analysis, okay? I'll give you some time to do this. Okay? Yes? Yes. 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 Oh, you put it in the introductory part. You put it in the introductory part, but you will still have a brief review in your introduction. Very brief review that leads to the gaps, and that the gaps should lead to your objectives. So you will have a very brief review in the introductory section. The purpose has to appear in the introduction. So brief review in the introduction, literature review will be detailed review in a separate chapter. Okay? Yeah, you would still do it. You would still do it, yes. Yeah.
Some students applying conceptual framework and literature review as a separate chapter.
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot I'm wearing this. Yeah, if it is allowed in your discipline, you can do that. But when I wrote my thesis, for instance, I had a separate chapter for theoretical framework. I had a separate chapter for literature review, because that's how it's done in FASS. But check your discipline again. See what other students have done. That would help. Or ask your supervisor. Yeah. Any questions? Feel free to ask questions. Yes. Yeah. Okay. If I understand your question right, what you're asking me is whether you can combine the results and discussion section or whether you can have two separate chapters. Again, I will go back to only one answer. Check other pieces in your related research area. Okay? If you combine both, that's fine. You can combine both, that's fine. In your results section, I will deal with it very soon. You will be mainly commenting on the data. You will be commenting on the data. But in your discussion, you will be interpreting the data for your reader. I will show you some examples soon after when we come to that. I had a separate results chapter and a separate discussion chapter, and I found it a bit difficult to keep the two separate. If you want, you can combine the two. It's okay to combine the two. If you're scared, you're going to sound very repetitive. If you can't keep the two apart, you can combine the two. But check with your supervisor again. He's the best person to advise you. Okay? Yes? Yeah. This is something, personally, I wouldn't do it. Personally, I would do it, but I have picked it up from somewhere else, okay? But then my students tell me that their supervisors are okay with it, and they tell me some journals are okay with it, you know? So I was expecting this question to come up. You're very perceptive, yeah. But I wouldn't do it. I would put a comma and then use a but. But this is something I'm reproducing from somewhere else. Yeah. This is a very simple activity. It's a very well-structured section of gap in purpose, as you can see. Any more questions so far? Yes? Oh, yeah. She was saying, is it okay to begin a sentence with but? Okay? Normally, I would say no. You know, this is something I point out to my students, but they tell me their supervisors are okay with it. Some of the journals are okay with it. You know, but I would never begin a sentence with but. I would put a comma and then continue the sentence. You know, but da 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 da. Yeah? Okay. So you go back to the what is allowed in your research area, I think. Yeah. Yeah, definitely not. And is a connector. It connects two sentences. So you cannot begin a sentence with and. You cannot begin a sentence with because. These things my students haven't argued with me, you know. So because indicates reason, you know. You can't begin a sentence with because. Okay? You need a reason and result. The two have to go together. Yeah. Why don't you put it afterwards? You know? So, you know, the reason comes later. Yeah. It's very informal, you see. That's another, you know, those are academic conventions. You have to use formal writing. Okay? When we speak, we begin sentences with because. But in academic writing, in an academic setting, you have to use formal language. It's very important. This is maybe someone from engineering should be answering this. This again, I have a lot of discussion with my students on this because in FASS, we never say I, we never say we. That's what you're referring to, right? Yeah? We never say, we use the passive voice. But apparently, please correct me if I'm wrong, in engineering, they are allowed to use we, maybe because they work so closely with the supervisor, you know. I tell them, you know, oh, no, my supervisor is okay with, then I say, if your supervisor is okay with it, that's fine. Because once a student, this was in the early years when I was teaching the module, he came and took me to task. He said, you're telling me all these things, I follow your conventions, then I go back, my supervisor is scolding me for doing all this. Then I told him, what I'm telling you are general guidelines, which is what I'm doing today. I'm giving you general guidelines. I said, follow the conventions in your discipline. That's when I learned to use that qualifier. Okay? Because I assume students would know, but they don't, you see. So I told them, at the end of the day, it's your supervisor you are going to live with for the next few years. You're going to live with me only for 12 weeks, so please do what your supervisor tells you to do. That's what I told him. Yeah. Can you speak louder, please, Simon? Okay. Actually, I would do that if I were you, and if it is allowed in your discipline, where your introduction can be an overview of all the other chapters that are going to be coming. You could do that, you know. Have the context for your whole research and tell your reader what the different chapters are all about. You could do that. Also check what others have done, you know, in your area. It helps sometimes. Okay? I hope you've done the task assigned to you. Can you check your answers with your neighbors? Because it's fairly simple. It's not that difficult, right? Okay? Gaps followed by, what did you all have? Sorry? Gaps followed by? Yeah, the general and specific objectives. Okay? And then, turning to the next page, what do you have? Yes, significance of the study. Look at the language used for significance here. Should provide. Remember I said very tentative. Modals are used. Should provide. Would increase. Yeah? Would deepen our understanding. Very tentative. Okay? So because this is the introductory chapter, you cannot sound too overconfident about your study just yet. These are just predictions you're making, and by the end of your research you may even change some of these predictions. It could be some other predictions as well. Okay? So take note of the language elements for significance. Followed by significance, what do we have? The scope, and then you have your thesis structure. The organization of the whole thesis should appear at the end of your introductory chapter if you follow the traditional pattern of organization. If it's topic-based, it could be very different. Okay? Maybe you will not have something like this at all. Yeah.
Speaking of tentativeness in terms of it seems to me that, especially for many journal articles, it seems that from what I'm from an engineering background, so from what I've seen is that many of the especially papers tend to be very firm in stating what their contribution is, rather than should or would.
Yeah. Journal paper is different. Journal paper is different. Because you're already reporting on the work that you have done, you see. So you would sound very confident. But remember, this is your introductory chapter in your thesis. So you're just laying out the predictions that you hope to achieve. And you will confirm these predictions in your conclusion section. Even if you have done, introduction, you have to sound tentative. But you must sound confident in your conclusion chapter. Because by then you will have conviction in what you have done as well. Yeah. Okay? So let's move on now. So that should give you an idea of how to go about writing your introduction chapter. Another point I want to make while I'm on the subject is, though I have given you the organization pattern for your introduction in terms of CRGP, this is something I advise all my students always have an outline before you write. Don't just start writing, then your organization will suffer. You have an outline of the different sections that you want your introduction to have. Have a brief outline for your context. Have a brief outline for the review part. Always have an outline so that you have your big picture in front of you before you start writing. Somebody mentioned about flow not being present in their writing. Try working on an outline first, and then you start writing. The flow is bound to be there, at least to some extent. You will know that you need to move logically from this section to another section. So make outlining a habit, a practice. Okay? Now, introduction, connections between sections. Remember, the different sections within a chapter need to be connected as well. Okay? Again, I want you to look at sample 1. Page 2, yeah? Look at how the writer is transiting from the context section to the review section. Current fabrication techniques. Fabrication is the key content word there. Okay? One way to establish links, one way to establish flow is to repeat the key concepts or the key content words. Okay? So the transition from one section to another becomes very clear. Okay? Now the review section I have already explained to you. It's very neatly organized based on 2 types of studies. From the review to the gap section. Look at how the writer uses transition. Studies on these effects. It's a very simple word, you know. This, these, it, they, all these are pronouns, but they help you to establish links between sections. So, you know the writer is referring to what went earlier. Okay? And then the last one, purpose. This work presents, instead of saying the work presents, can you see the difference? The work, this work. It's just a matter of, you know, substituting a 3-letter word with a 4-letter word, but look at the difference in meaning. So don't underestimate pronouns, please. They are very, very useful when you want to connect your information across sections. This is one way you take care of the information flow. I always tell my students, thesis writing is like driving, you know. You go from point A, you need to go to point Y. You need all these traffic directions, right? You know, you need to know where to turn left, you need to know where to turn right. You need all these instructions. So your reader, your examiner, who's going to be reading your thesis, needs these signposts. If he can, you know, if his journey, you know, if his reading journey of your PhD thesis is smooth, you're going to create a very positive impression. But if he has to stop and stop and stop, we know we are in trouble. So that information flow is very, very important, and it's important that you establish links across the different sections in your chapters. Okay, we move on to methods. Now methods, I'm not going to talk about organization because methods vary from discipline to discipline, and it's very content based. So I find students are very confident about handling the methods and the results chapter because it is their forte, it's their area. Okay, so I will just talk about the purpose. What is the purpose of your methods section? To introduce the methods you've used for supporting your research objectives. Very clear, very obvious, right? And also, you have to tell your readers, your examiner, that the methods that you have used are sound, relevant, and valid. Very, very important to draw conclusions reached at the end. If there is some loophole in our methodology, of course, the results cannot stand, you know. The foundation for the results, the base is no longer there. To justify using the methods selected for the data collection. Why did you use these methods? Who are the other researchers who use these methods? Are your methods different? You bring in that aspect as well. You would have to cover this in your literature review, by the way, because if you're talking about methods in your study, you would have to talk about studies that have either used these methods or not used these methods. If you've modified these methods, you have to say all that in your literature review as well. To justify the choices of methods applied, especially if the selected methods are different from the methods used by other researchers. I've mentioned that already. So we finished introduction, we finished methods, we now move on to results. What is the purpose? Results to present the data of the study clearly and meaningfully. Yes? Uh-huh. Yes. Okay. You cannot assume. Okay.
How do we compare it? When you say that, okay, this person has used this method, I'm using this method, what's the justification for that?
Yeah. See, when you write your methods draft, you're going to be writing several drafts of your chapter. Yeah, you realize that. So when you're writing methods chapter and you're not very confident, in this present state, if you're going to be writing your methods draft, somewhere make notes and say, I need to justify my methods are better. And as you're doing your experiment, you live with your PhD, for 3 years, 4 years. By the end of it, you will know why your method is better. Go back and update your methods chapter. That's one way of handling it. If you're not very confident, make little notes, in the middle of the night, also we'll get some ideas, because we live with our PhD for so long, right? I find these post-its are very useful. Have it by your bedside and put down because the next day morning you'll forget, Put down those ideas immediately, and then incorporate them. With computers now, it's very easy to make notes of all these things. The next day morning, incorporate it in the appropriate chapter, okay, in your files or in your folder, depending on how you organize your writing, okay? Anything else? Yes?
Is it like a business proposal when you are writing your purpose, like your method, highlighting the important points? Is it you must see your audience like accepting you as a business? What I want to invest in your business? That kind of thinking and write the method.
No, I don't think I wouldn't use the word business. This is academia we are talking about. I would not use the word business, but I would say writing with conviction is important. When you write. Sorry?
Like the starting point of your whole research project.
Yeah. This is where it would come under the significance of your study. You highlight why your study is. You're not selling, you're not selling. But I don't like the word selling, but that's why I'm using the word conviction. If you feel good about what you have done, or even if you don't feel good, I don't want to use the word selling, I don't want to use the word selling, but say it in a very convincing way using appropriate words. Yeah? The academic world and the commercial world is very different. Maybe now there is a blurring, I don't know. Okay. Anything else before we move on? Okay. Let's move on to the results section. What is the purpose? To present the data clearly and meaningfully. I think the emphasis should be on those two words. It's very important. To highlight results which provide answers to your research questions. This is something my students ask me. They have all these results. Which one do they pick and choose? Because ultimately, lots of things will show up. So please remember your research objectives and choose those data that answer your research objectives and highlight them. That is the clue. To highlight the most important points in your data, how do you choose? What criteria do you use? You choose your highest and lowest values that may emerge. In your discipline, in your kind of study, I don't know what will show up, but use the highest and the lowest values. Look at the trend, the pattern in numbers. It could be either rising or falling, or rising and falling, whatever. Look at that pattern. And also, when we collect our data and when we analyze our data, we do have certain expectations. There are bound to be deviations. There are bound to be exceptions. Do you panic? I don't know. My supervisor told me don't panic. She said justify it based on your methods, based on your theory. I don't know, but my engineering students tell me they cannot do that because it's very scientific. The discipline is very scientific. So I said, what will you do? They said, we will conduct the experiments again. So again, it depends on your discipline. Okay? So results organization. How do you organize your results? You organize your results by locating your results. You highlight key data. You comment on key data. Now, what do I mean by each of these? Let me give you examples. Actually, you'll be very, very familiar with these examples, especially those of you who've written journal papers. Figure 7.2, you're locating your data in this figure. Sometimes it could be a table, it could be a graph, it could be any of those visual means of displaying data. 7.2 displays the mean percentile scores. What does the data represent? The mean percentile scores on the 4 subtests, etc., etc. So this is locating the results. All of you should be familiar with this. Now, highlighting key results. Students in the French immersion programs performed significantly better. You're not just reproducing numbers here. You're also highlighting the significance of the results. Okay, that's highlighting key results. Then you move on to commenting. Clearly, the findings indicate, I won't use the word clearly here. To me, it is very subjective. And subjectivity should not be allowed in academic writing, but I'm taking someone else's work. So the learning point here is, don't just copy other people's writing. Think before using. I should have thought about it, but I said this could be a good discussion point today, so I just left it there. So don't bring any subjective element in your writing. The findings indicate, the choice of verbs are very important. The findings indicate that the amount of exposure to a foreign language has a positive effect. This is your comment. This is your deduction from the data. So that is commenting on your results. Okay? So the 3 components: locating, highlighting, commenting. Can have another acronym for this, I think. Okay. What are the types of comments that you can use? Generalization, comparison, contrast, explanation. Now, what are generalizations? These are deductions you draw and implications from the results that you derive at. Okay? The results suggest, what do they suggest? That development of primitive Comparison, contrast, I don't have to tell you that. You just compare the results that you have obtained with the results from other studies maybe, or if you have conducted several experiments and there's a variation in results, you can bring that in as well. Then you have explanation, speculation. Very, very important. The reasons why you have obtained these results. Okay? This is because, providing reason, the activated thermal emission region is controlled by So these are the 3 types of comments you can use in your results, even discussion and conclusion actually. Next, yes, sorry.
Now there's this blur about, does it form a part of the discussion, because you're still kind of giving reasons for why you got this result.
Yeah.
Should this be a part of the discussion? This is where the confusion I am having.
Yeah, that's a very good point actually. Giving reasons, because you have to comment on your results, right? So what you can do maybe, if this is a confusion that arises, you keep your comment very superficial in the results part, but you can bring it in the discussion part. This is a delicate balance you have to strike, which is why I suggested it's good to combine the results and discussion. But again, it depends on the nature of your research. So what you can do when you're talking about your results, commenting on your results, you just stick to what is evident, you know. But the more insightful comments, you can leave it for the discussion section. As you're writing it, you will know how to differentiate the two. But it's a good point. I too had that kind of problem. Yes.
How do the words and research which are negative? Like sometimes if I write, it feels as if it degrades the work I have done. But still I want to write it so that others don't waste their time doing the same thing.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, yeah, because this is something that came up in our class as well, because they told me first that they will not even talk about the negative results. Then I told them it's good to talk about the negative results for the same reason that you mentioned, others don't waste time. So how do you phrase it? Unless I have an example or a piece of text, it's very hard for me to advise you. My email address is there. Can you email me a paragraph of yours? But I don't have the background knowledge, you see, to what you are.
Like I spent like 1 year optimizing something, but I write one line, the protocol was optimizing. This is what exactly I did, but
Can you help here with your experience in engineering? Sorry, I'm not an expert in.
I just want to write something about whatever I optimize for my final experiment.
Right.
It doesn't add much to my conclusion or something.
See, sometimes it's like that. I'll tell you an example. There are papers that are written on controlling a bioreactor, for example, and detailed algorithms, this, that, and all results are given. You see another paper in bioengineering, they just say the reactor temperature was controlled perfectly at 80 degrees, that's all. For somebody to challenge to control it and they write papers and algorithms about it, somebody will just say, so it depends on the kind of journal you write to and what's the focus of the journal. In some journals, it has to end up as a single line, unfortunately. In some journals, you can elaborate the whole experience and write it to somebody's benefit.
Yes.
Is it okay to, comment or link or compare the results across the chapter?
I think so. If it is relevant, you should. In the brackets, you can say, refer to chapter, section, this, and you can compare. Yeah, it should be okay, yeah. Now, going back to your point, sorry, I have been thinking about, writing. One way to tone down is to come up with suggestions to improve whatever you have done. Is that possible? You see, you can do it that way. When you come up with recommendations, suggestions, the limitations won't seem that striking. Okay, so that's one way to get around the problem. Yes. Yeah. And also what you have learned from the whole exercise, in the form of recommendations, suggestions, or insights you have gained about it, that I think, then the learning process comes through, you see. So focus on the learning process perhaps. Anybody else who wants to, sorry.
It's okay to write negative experiences.
Okay.
In engineering, if you have any negative experiences. In a thesis, it's okay. Whether a journal will buy it and publish it, that's
Yeah.
wrong. That's a different issue.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
in a thesis, you can always explain in all detail what you did, and despite all this, it didn't work, and maybe for the possible reasons, right? You can find out. Thesis is okay.
Okay, somebody else? The failure aspect. That was the question he was asking. Yeah.
There is a problem either in fabrication, the conduct of the experiment, collection of data from sensors. There will be very different reasons why we get these kind of negative results. So as part of our research, what we do is we kind of flip the system, make sure that all the things are in place. And once you're sure of that, all right, then if you get anything negative beyond that, beyond all the care that you've taken, it's okay to report it in your thesis for sure. But if the first experiment fails, it's probably not a good idea to report it because you're still gaining an experience, and maybe there are so many things that were not set right. So it depends on, journal articles, I'm not sure. It's a little bit tough. They will not buy it, unfortunately. Yeah. Only the good results sometimes takes it to journal articles.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. She has I don't know if I heard you correctly. What she's saying is, if your first experiment fails, like Prof. Lak said, don't report it. But if your second experiment is successful, you can bring in information from the first experiment and say, these are some of the things not to do as part of your second one. I don't know if that can be done. Going back to FISS, we do what is known as pilot studies, constantly. And subsequent studies, we report on the pilot studies, the problems we had, the mistakes we made. And then we improve on it, and then we report. But again, each discipline is different, yeah? Okay. So let's move on. Any more questions? I don't think I should ask. Okay. Because it's getting too discipline specific for me. Okay. So we move on to the last component, which is the discussion, not the last, second last, discussion. What is the purpose of the discussion? Now, I know there's going to be some comments here. I will wait for questions later. Now, the purpose is to present the principles, relationships, and the generalizations that come out of the results of your study. Earlier, I did mention generalizations. Those generalizations will be directly related to your results, okay? This one could extend a bit further here when you draw generalizations. Do not repeat your results in your discussion, but what you do is to interpret them and show how they agree or disagree with previously published work. You point out exceptions or lack of contrast correlations. The exceptions are from what you expected. You also discuss theoretical implications. Remember, if you have a theoretical framework base, you can talk about the theoretical implications and also the practical application of your results. How is it beneficial? How is it significant? And you also discuss the limitations of the proposed research. As you are explaining, you can talk about the limitations as well. Okay? So this is the purpose of discussion. Let me give you some examples. This good correlation between the model and experimental data shows the validity of the proposed model in evaluating something. Secondly, it's important to note that the method used in this study produces the results far more efficiently, effectively than someone else's method, and then you go on to explaining how effective or efficient it is. So this is what you would include in your discussion. Conclusion, IMRDC, the last bit, purpose. What is the purpose of your conclusion chapter? Is very, very important. Research has shown that examiners read your abstract first to get an overall view of your research. Then they read the conclusion chapter, and only then they read the introduction chapter. So your conclusion chapter is very, very important because it also links all the chapters In particular, the introduction and the conclusion. I will explain as I go along. So whatever changes you make to one can affect the changes to the other. For example, if you're talking about the significance of your study in the conclusion, if it is something you have not mentioned, you can go back and make changes to your introduction. Similarly, limitation, if you're talking about it in the conclusion, you go back and make changes to the scope that you mentioned in your study, okay? So none of the chapters will be a finished product. You will constantly be reworking on your different chapters as you go along, okay? So keep them current during the writing process. Your conclusion chapter, the purpose is to convince the reader of the value of your research. You do not sell your research, but you make a case in a very convincing manner for the significance of your research, of the contributions that your study is making. It relates work to broader research areas. It goes beyond the narrow focus of your research objectives. Okay, here you extend the significance of your study, the findings, to broader research areas. Serves as a logical outcome of the results and discussion section. In other words, you should not bring in new information that is not derived from your results and discussion in your conclusion section. You have to be very, very careful, okay? Because it's very, very closely tied to your results and discussion section. It pulls the whole research together. So it plays a very, very important role. All the chapters are important, but this one is the one that brings everything together, okay? So, conclusions. How do you organize your conclusions chapter? You restate the aims here. Remember, you mentioned your aims in your introduction section. You restate your aims here. You tell your reader, these were my aims, and my research has addressed these research questions. And you explain, you summarize how you have addressed your research questions. So what do? You review your key results. You relate your work to broader research areas. Again, the three terms come back here, which is comparison, explanation, and generalization. Now you move on to broader areas. Earlier, results and discussion stays within the scope of your study, of your research. Here you extend it to broader areas. You extend discussion further to show research questions are addressed, but you also emphasize contributions your study has made, okay? You also evaluate the significance of your study, how good it is as compared to some other studies, and also talk about the practical and theoretical applications. You recommend further research or application. Recommendations are very, very important, okay? Similarly, limitations also can be mentioned in your conclusion. So these are the different organizational elements that you need to include in your conclusion. So we move on to the last activity of the evening, which is your sample 3, okay? All the organizational elements are given there, restating of aims, stating key results, etc., etc. Can you quickly, I don't know if it's possible, please identify the different elements, and you can also underline the key words indicating the elements, if that will help you to identify the organizational elements. Can you do this now? I'll give you a few minutes. don't worry about the content. Just look at some of the keywords and look at the organization only. If it's not something you're familiar with, you can discuss with your neighbors, even if you don't know them. Okay, what do you think? Is it well organized? Sorry? Is it clear? You may not know the content. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but organization-wise, do you think it flows well? Are all the elements there? Okay, maybe I should take you through. Sorry, all the elements there here? Oh, it looks like a discussion section? Oh, it is, this is, you can see each of those paragraphs pertains to a certain aim in the study. It discusses the results and the significance of the study. Is this how you would write your discussion as well, is it? Here you can, yeah. This is a student's writing that I brought along. Instead of getting something from a thesis, I thought I'll get students' piece of writing. Okay, what about the first paragraph? What is the function of the first paragraph here? Sorry? The aim, okay. This is what we call an overview, okay? Remember to begin your chapters, if you can, with an overview of the whole chapter. For example, here, the student says, 3 types of systems were studied in this thesis, okay? And then moves on to say, the conclusions for these 3 types of systems are summarized in sequence below. At the end of this chapter, the limitations of the thesis are discussed and some recommendations are made. You must remember this is a very short extract, okay? I've just brought it along as a sample. It's not a model. There's a difference between a sample and a model, okay? You can use it as a rough guideline, but it's written by a student and there are some language errors in it as well, okay? The first paragraph is an overview. Very important to have an overview at the beginning of each chapter because your chapters are going to be very lengthy and you need to tell your reader what you're going to cover in the rest of the chapter, okay? So that's the overview. And if you look at the second paragraph, without looking at the content in detail, what do we have? The writer begins with the aim of the study, okay, was analyzed, okay, the nature of binding. Then she goes, I know it's a she goes on to discussing the results. Was found to be non-negligible, were found to consist of, etc., etc. And then if you go further down, paragraph 2, this study not only provides important insights, but has also created something, significance of the study. Okay? Then the third paragraph, the strongest limit of the has been explored. Again, relating it to the aims of the study, followed by the results, okay? Then comparing the results, okay? And if you turn to the next page, this might be explained, providing an explanation for the results, and then come further down, are investigated in this study. Okay, page 7, first paragraph, third line from the bottom, followed by which would improve our understanding of these 2 basic concepts, the significance of the study. Okay, if we went on to analyze the rest of the text, you will see that there's a logical flow in the way the student summarizes the results, relates the results to the aims, provides either explanation or comparison, and talks about the significance of the study in the context of the results. And towards the end, you have the advantage of using such method, significance, and then you have limitation as well towards the end. And it concludes with a recommendation. Okay? This is where I always say have an outline even for your conclusion chapter. Pick out the significant results you want to bring in your conclusion and organize, draw an outline for your conclusion chapter and then start writing. Otherwise, the writing can be very disorganized. So that sort of ends our IMRDC pattern of organization. We looked at the different components. The links between chapters. Remember, you have to connect the different chapters. Each chapter, in fact, feeds into the other if you look at it. For example, the introduction, remember your CRGP feeds into the literature review, and then based on your objectives in the introduction, you come up with your methods section, and based on your methods, you conduct your research and you have your results, and based on your results, you discuss your findings, and then based on your results and discussion, you come up with some general conclusions about your study, which includes the significance of your study and recommendations for future work as well. So you can see what is a massive document can be broken into several chapters, and each of the chapters is interconnected. Okay? So remember, I told you the introduction and conclusion are very closely linked. This table tells you the aims are presented in the introduction, the objectives of your study, and then in the conclusion you tell your reader, I have addressed the objectives. I have provided answers to the research questions that I asked at the beginning. Results, you don't talk about the results in your introduction, but you do talk about your results in the conclusion. Significance is mentioned in the introduction, but in very tentative terms. It is mentioned in the conclusion, but more as achievements, in less tentative terms, and even stronger terms, depending on how convincing you want to sound. Okay? Scope. You lay the boundaries of your research in your introduction, but you talk about them as limitations in your conclusion, and based on your limitations, you make recommendations for your study. Okay? If you need these slides, I can arrange with CDTL for the slides to be sent to you all. Okay? So, establishing connections across chapters. Remember, we used sample 1 to see how the writer moves from one section to another. You also need to establish links across chapters, between chapters as well. So one way is to have your overview statement. That can be very, very useful. Remember, I showed you the example. You write a few statements giving an overview of what you intend to cover in the chapter. Another way is to summarize, especially if your chapters are very, very long. Remember, your examiner, your main reader, should not get lost when he or she is reading your thesis. So, intermittent summaries of what you have covered, the salient points, can be very, very useful for the reader to recapitulate what you have written earlier. Number 3, preview statements. Write a few statements indicating what is to be followed. Okay? It can be done at the end of the chapter or even at the end of a section to establish a link with the next section or with the next chapter. So these 3 concepts are very important in your writing to establish links between chapters. Now, examples, overview. The review of research on breakout phenomenon in clay presented here will focus on This is again written by a student. In addition, a brief review on the theoretical and numerical studies is also presented at the end. That is your overview. Now, summary and preview. Having discussed, you summarize the main points. The next 2 sections will focus on. Okay? So, the reader is taken through in a seamless manner from one section to the other. Okay? Samples 2 and 3, can we quickly look at sample 2? Sample 2, last paragraph. This thesis will be organized as follows. That, in a way, is an overview because it's giving an overview of the whole thesis. But what you can do is, you can include a preview statement at the end to say, The next chapter will review studies pertaining to relevant areas in this study. That means you're telling your reader the next chapter is your literature review chapter. So you take your reader from chapter 1 to chapter 2. Okay? So that would be your overview and preview example. And then sample 3 I've already mentioned. First paragraph is a kind of an overview. So these are ways of establishing links across chapters. And within a chapter, I mentioned earlier, repetition of content words, use of pronouns, use of summary words like based on the above discussion, and then you continue. Okay, these are different ways of establishing links. So summary, what have we looked at this evening? We looked at the macro organization, the overall organization of a thesis. The general traditional pattern is the IMRDC pattern. We looked at the organization of introduction, the CRGP elements, context, review, gap, and purpose. We also looked at the purpose of all chapters, including literature review, methods, and discussion chapters. We looked at the organization of the conclusion chapter and also at how to establish links within and across chapters. So, is thesis writing a challenge? Yes. I didn't expect to work magic, within an hour or so. My objective, like I said at the beginning, was to mainly raise your awareness about certain aspects of organization in a thesis. But remember, it is also discipline specific. What I have given you are general guidelines for you to remember and follow, but go back and check the conventions in your own discipline. So with that, good luck and thank you for listening. But we still have 10 minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. But if you're hungry, please feel free to leave. But the floor is open if you want to ask more questions. I only heard headings and subheadings under each chapter. Yes, yes. Yeah. Yeah. That is why I said have an outline with the headings, subheadings, and have under... Yeah. Actually, I can't hear you. Maybe you can come down and we can have a chat. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, this is my water. Thank you. That was a good audience. I like the students. They were good. I learned, yeah, sure.
I was wondering if you would take this course, 5,002.
That's right. I do take
Actually,
this.